Hi, my name's Alistair Chapman, and in this video we're going to take a look at shooting with the custom mode in this camera here, Sony's PXW-FS7. Now, custom mode is one of two shooting modes in the camera, the other being the Cine EI mode. The Cine EI mode is really suited to drama and movie style productions and is a two-stage workflow where you shoot using a wide dynamic range gamma curve in the camera, and then in post-production you create the finished look of your pictures. Custom mode, the mode that we're going to look at in this video, is really what I would call a what you see is what you get mode, because what you see in the viewfinder is what you record, and generally that is what your end customer, the viewer, will see. There is still some room to do some post-production color correction and grading to the material that you shoot in custom mode, but basically the mode is designed around creating the look or the style of your production in the camera. Now, from the factory, the camera is set up to record using a gamma curve called Rec. 709, and this is the standard gamma used for the majority of television production. This is the type of gamma curve that your TV or monitor will have. So when you shoot with the standard gamma, the contrast on your TV or monitor should match fairly closely to the contrast of the scene that you are shooting. But there are some limitations with standard gammas. In particular, they have a limited dynamic range. So in certain circumstances, you may have problems with highlights and the brighter parts of the picture overexposing. But there are some things we can do about that in custom mode, because the camera does have a choice of several different gamma curves. So if we go to the paint menu on the camera and select the gamma options, and we scroll down to gamma category, you'll see that you have several options. These include standard, HG, user, S-Log2 and S-Log3. The one that's most interesting in this camera in custom mode is the Hypergammas. The Hypergammas add a film-like roll-off to the footage, and they handle overexposure much better than the standard gammas in most situations. So let's take a closer look at those. So looking at the gamma select function, we have a choice of 6 Hypergammas, Hypergammas 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 and 8. The numbers and letters that identify each of these Hypergammas in the menu, for example for Hypergamma number 1, 3250 G36, tell us a lot about the way the gamma curve works. The first 3 characters of the name, 325 in this case, indicate the dynamic range or contrast range compared to 709. So 325% greater than 709, so a much bigger contrast and dynamic range. If we look at Hypergamma number 2, for example, 460 G30, this has 460% greater range than 709. The 4th character in the gamma curve's name is either a 0 or a 9, and it indicates the recording range or the peak white level. If it's a 0, peak white will be 100%, and if it's a 9, peak white will be 109%. Now, if you're doing anything for broadcast television, then really you want to stick to Hypergammas number 1 and Hypergammas number 2, because these are restricted to 100%. They will not record a range greater than 100%, and that makes the recordings safe and ready for broadcast. If you're doing stuff for the web, for the internet, for general production work, then normally you can use any of the curves that go to 109%. So any of the curves with a 9 in it will normally work best for you. The final 3 characters of the name is a G and 2 numbers. So in the case of HG1, it's G36. This is actually the middle grey exposure reference point. Now, if you were using a grey card to expose with these, that's the level at which you would expose middle grey. Now, I wouldn't get too hung up on this, it's not critical, but as a point of reference, when you're shooting with normal 709 gamma, the normal standard gamma in this camera, you'd normally expose middle grey to be about 41 or 42%, and that would put white around about 90%. Your normal television type exposure levels. But as you can see, looking through this list of gamma curves for the hypergammas, that middle grey point is lower. And what that is telling you is that these should be exposed a little bit darker than you would normally expose 709. Now, why is that? Well, that's because they are capturing a greater dynamic range. To record that greater dynamic range, we need to shift our recording levels down a little bit to make room for the extra dynamic range at the top. So by recording just a little bit darker, we gain a better highlight roll-off and a better response to our overexposure. In post-production, the hypergammas do benefit from a little bit of tweaking or a little bit of very small color correction. The way I use them is to expose about half a stop to a stop lower than I would with a conventional standard gamma, and then in post-production just do a little brightness and contrast change just to tweak my shots if they need it. So that means setting zebras at around 60% instead of 70% if you use zebras to set your exposure. It's a small difference, but it is worth doing. It does improve the way the pictures look in your finished production. Now, the other thing we can learn from the names of these hypergamma curves is which curve to use in which type of lighting situation. Now, if you're dealing with a very contrasty scene, you're going to want to use a hypergamma with a very big dynamic or contrast range. So either a 460 or an 800% range. If you're shooting in low light or a lower contrast scene, then you would use a hypergamma with a smaller dynamic range. So a 325% curve instead of the 460. Do be aware though that because these gamma curves can capture a much greater dynamic range, that sometimes the picture on the screen might have a little bit less contrast than if you were using standard gamma. But again, that can easily be adjusted using a contrast and brightness correction in post-production. I tend to use hypergamma number 3 for indoor shooting, for interviews and things like that, and then hypergamma number 4 for a lot of outdoor shooting. If you're using any of the hypergammas that go above 100%, so that's any of the hypergammas where the fourth number is a 9, so that's hypergammas 3, 4, 7 and 8, you need to make another change in the paint settings of the camera, and that's the white clip setting. If you go to the white clip settings, you'll see that the factory default is lower than the 109% that the hypergammas can record to. So to get the best from the hypergammas, you should set the white clip to 109%.